Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a full stack web application with Python Django in the backend and React.js in the front end. And in the end it's going to look something like this, where we have an application with a nice looking navigation menu and also the option to create, read, edit, and also finally delete records from the database. Now this is already the sixth video in this series. We've already completed the setup of the front end and the back end. We've created a nice looking navigation menu, including page navigation with React Router. And in the last video, we also already created all of the models inside of our Python Django backend. Now in this video, we're going to continue and I'm going to show you how we can create an API in our Django backend by using Django Rest Framework. And that means that after this video, we will be able to expose data to a specific URL, which we can then pick up with our front end to actually start building a lot of functionality. Now to realize that, we're going to be following 6 steps. We're going to start with an explanation of how Django APIs work. Then we're going to be installing Django Rest Framework and make some changes to our settings. After that, we're able to create a serializer, a view with viewsets, a URL endpoint, and then check out the end result on our backend server. Now let's start with an explanation on what an API actually is and why we need to do that. Well, inside of our Django backend, all of the data will be stored in the SQLite database. And we've already created some tables in the last video so that we can store data in a certain format. However, in our React.js frontend, we actually want to use that data because we want to get the data and display it on the front page. But we also want to post data, so create records. We want to update records and we want to delete records. And the way that React can communicate with this database for creating, reading, updating, and deleting records is by sending certain requests to URLs. So every communication between our backend and our frontend will be through an API, and that API is nothing more than a URL which tells our database what to do. Now, to create an API, so something that our frontend can read and consume, we need to do a bunch of stuff in our backend. For every API that we're going to be creating, we will need a view, a serializer, and a URL. Now, all of these three things have a different function. So the URL will actually define at what web address we can find the API. So what URL do we need to use to get data from a certain part of our database? Next, we also have a serializer. And the serializer is going to make the translation between the backend and the frontend. Because our frontend likes to send and receive data in the JSON format, but our backend, our SQLite database, does not really like that structure. So there needs to be something in between which makes that translation. And that is what our serializer py file is doing. It's making sure that the JSON format is being converted to something that our database can understand. The last component that we have here is a view, and the view brings those things together. So it's going to tell a little bit about the request. So is it a GET request, or is it a POST request, or even a PUT or a retrieve request? Is going to also specify what model we want to take data from into the API. So it specifies the table from which we actually want to bring data to the front end. And it also lists down which serializer needs to serialize the data. And all of this will hopefully become very clear during this video. Now, to create these APIs inside of our Django backend, we use Django Rest Framework. And you can see right here that Django Rest Framework is a powerful and flexible toolkit for building these web APIs. And the second step in this video is to actually install Django Rest Framework inside of our project. So we're going to go to installation, and in there it explains to us how we can install this package. So what we need to do is we need to take this pip install for Django Rest Framework, and then we can go to our code and make sure that the package is installed in the backend. So we open a new terminal, we cd into the backend folder, and we also start our virtual environment by doing venv/scripts/activate. And then we can install the package by doing python-m and then pip install Django Rest Framework. Now we can also see right here that we need to place Rest Framework inside of our installed apps of our project settings. So what we will do is we're going to go back to our code, to the backend folder, and then to CRUD, to the settings.py file, and in the installed apps section, we're going to list down the rest_framework. And let's save that. And now we should be able to use all of the functionality from that package inside of our backend project. Now, what I want to do in this video is make sure that we can make all of the data that we've defined in the models.py file, and especially the country, the league, and the characteristics, can be read by our React.js frontend. Now, the first thing that we need to do to arrange that is make sure that we have a serializer, so that the data between the frontend and the backend can be translated to the right structures. So inside of our API folder, I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to be calling that serializers.py. And in there, we're going to define all of the serializers for our models. Now, creating a serializer is actually quite easy. On the top, we start with a few imports. So from rest underscore framework, we're going to import serializers. And then also from our .models file, we're going to import everything. Then we can create a serializer, and let's do that first for the model called country. So we can do class and then say country serializer. And then in here, we define serializers.model serializer. Now this class is going to expect us to provide some additional information, and we do that inside of something called class meta. And below that, we need to specify which model we want to serialize. And in this case, we want to serialize country, because that is the first one that we've defined in this file. And what it also wants us to provide is the fields that we want to serialize. Because if you have really big models, you might not want to take all of those fields. Now in this case, what we're going to be doing is taking the field of ID, because Django always generates an ID for every row. And I also want to take the name field. And you can see in our models.py file that name is indeed one of the fields that is available. We also have created and modified as fields, but I don't think they're going to be that relevant in this tutorial series. So this is fine for now. Now we can actually quite quickly do the same thing, but then for the league and the characteristic model, because those are going to be exactly the same. They have the same column names. The only change is the name of the actual model. So in the serialized.py file, I'm just going to copy this over and paste it twice. And now we just change the name. So this is not going to be the country serializer, but the league serializer. And now the model is going to be league. And then we can do the same here, where we're going to be calling this last one the characteristic serializer. And also the model here is going to be characteristic. And those fields can be exactly the same as before. So let's save that. And let's also make one for the football club so that we can build on that in the next video. So again, I'm going to be copying over this serializer. But now we're going to be calling this the football club serializer. And the model is also going to be called football clubs. Let's check that in the file quickly. Yeah, it's football club like this. Now in here, I want to just take all of the fields because we have a lot more fields than in the other models. And actually all of these will be relevant later on when we are creating functionality for the full CRUD process. So in here, I can list them all down inside of this list. But what we can also do is just add some parentheses and do underscore underscore all and then underscore underscore. And now this serializer knows that we want to take all of the fields to the front end. Okay, so now one part of the puzzle is done because we have the mechanism that can translate the data between the front end and the backend structures. But we still need to create a view that is going to tell us what data we need to take, what mode we're going to be requesting, such as post or get or retrieve. And also we still don't actually have a URL of where we can actually find our API. Now for creating views inside of my Django backend, I always really like to use viewsets. Now viewsets allow you to create different classes inside of your backend, and within one class you can define different functions. So if we scroll down a little bit in the documentation, we can define functions for list, create, retrieve, update, partial update, and destroy. Now these different functions are all of the typical CRUD operations that you would do in your backend. So as an example, if you provide the function of list, it would just create a list of all of the records in a certain model. If you would use the create, it would enable the method for creating records through the API. And if you would use destroy, it would actually delete. So this is quite a convenient way to have all of these different operations inside of one class. And what's even more convenient is that later on in the URLs, we can define just one URL, and that will automatically work for all of these different functions. But more on that later on. So let's now build a view set on our own. Now to do that, we are going to go to the views.py file. And on the top, we're going to start with a few imports. So firstly, we're going to do from rest underscore framework. And we're going to be importing viewsets and also permissions. Then we also want to get all of the information from the serializer that we have just created. So we do from.serializers, and we're going to be importing all. Now we also would like to have the data from our models. So we also do from.models import all. And also from rest underscore framework dot response, we're going to be importing response. And this should be everything that we need to create the view sets. So let's start with country. So we can create a class called country viewset. And in there we specify viewsets.viewset. And actually set needs to be with a capital as well. Now, before we start using the functions that we also saw inside of the documentation, we need to provide a few settings in there. The first one is permission underscore classes. And this is going to determine who is able to actually consume this data. Because sometimes inside of your application, you have login functionality. So you only want people that are authenticated to be able to use that data. Now, in this tutorial, we actually don't have logging functionality. So I'm just going to set the permissions to permissions.allow any. And that means that anyone can consume that data as long as they come from my React.js frontend, of course. Then we can also define an initial query set. And the query set needs to be the model that we want to get data from inside of our API. Now we want to get it from our country model. So inside of that setting, I'm going to say that this is going to be equal to country.objects.all. Now, we also need to specify what is going to serialize this country data. So what is going to be the translator between frontend and backend? And we do that in serializer underscore class. And we set that equal to the country serializer. And now that we've defined these more general things on the top, we can create different functions for the different operations that need to happen. So the first thing what I would like to do in this video is create a list of all of the different countries and expose that to our frontend. So what we can do if we take a look at the documentation is use the function for list, because that is going to make sure that all of the objects are going to be available in our API. So similarly to the documentation, I'm going to say that we want to have a function called list, and it takes in the arguments of self and also request. Now in here, we again need to specify a query set, and I'm going to set that equal to country.objects.all, because I want all of the countries to be exposed to the frontend. Then we can say that we want to use a certain serializer to serialize this information, and I'm going to refer it to self.serializer underscore class, and that simply refers to this one right here. So I'm just telling it to use this serializer that we've already defined before. And the thing that we want to serialize, that's the first thing that we need to specify here, is going to be the query set. So it's going to serialize everything from country.objects.all. And we will also set many equal to true, because we can expect many records. Now the last thing that we need to do is return something, because we've now said that we want to serialize something, but what we actually want to return is a response to our front end or wherever we see the data. And that is going to be equal to the serializer dot data. And that means that we just want to get the serialized data and bring that to the frontend. Okay, so we have now defined how we need to translate data between frontend and backend. And also we've established this view that is going to tell it exactly what needs to go to the API and also what is going to translate that. But the last thing that we now miss is an actual URL where we can access that data. So let's now create that. And if we go back to this documentation and we scroll a little bit down, you can see that the way that we can handle the URLs for these different functions is a little bit different than we might be used to. Because what you can do is create a different URL for each of these functions. So for list, we will have a URL for retrieve, but there are a bunch more different options because we also have update, partial update, and destroy. However, that would mean that we would maybe even need to define 6 different URLs inside of our URLs.py file. And if you need to do that for multiple classes, that can be quite some work. Now, luckily, there's quite an easy solution for this, and that is to use a router. And what this router does is it's going to create one route or one URL for each of the view sets, and it automatically, based on the functions that are specified in this view set, is going to accept this list, retrieve, and other URLs. So we just need to define one URL per class, and it will automatically generate different URLs for these different functions. So we're going to go to our urls.py file and establish everything that we need right there. So in here, we're going to make a few changes. We start with some imports. So I'm going to do from.views and then import all, because we need to match the view to a certain URL in the end. And we're also going to do from rest underscore framework and then dot routers, and we're going to be importing default router. Now we don't actually need this URL patterns anymore like this, so we're just going to leave that in for now. We're going to start by defining router and say that that is going to be equal to the default router. Then we can register different routes. So I can say router.register. And in there, I can specify some details on how I want to register a certain route for a view set. So the first thing that it wants to know is what is going to be the endpoint or the extension, the link that basically the extension of the link that we want to see. Now in this case, I'm doing it for the country. So I'm going to say that the URL needs to end in country. Then it also wants to know what viewset is going to provide the data for the country URL. And this is going to be the country viewset that we have just created. And then as the last thing, it also wants to know a base name, and that is going to be equal to country. And this is just to identify what is going on there. Now the final thing that we can do is we can set this URL patterns equal to router. And what this will do is that all of the registered routers are going to come together as the URL patterns. And actually one final change that we need to make, we don't need to set it equal to router, but actually to router.urls. And let's save that. And now let's check out the end result inside of our backend server by doing python manage.py and then run server. And we can see that our server is now running successfully. And let's now follow this link. And now you can see that the screen that shows up when we start our backend server actually looks a lot different than what we were used to in the previous video. We can actually see here that we have a link for country. And if we see here, we see the full link with the extension that we specified in the URLs. And if we now go actually to that URL, we can see all of the entries that we have put inside of our database in the last video, and are going to be available for our frontend to be picked up in this URL. Now you can actually see that the methods that it's allowed are very limited, because currently it only allows get at the moment. But later on in this tutorial series, we can also make sure that we allow other actions. So we can allow create, retrieve, update, partial update, and destroy. And that means that with one of these links, we would be able to do multiple things. Now, as a last step in this video, let's also make this available not only for country, but also for characteristics and for leagues. And that is going to be quite straightforward, because what we can do is we can go to the views.py file and we can just copy over this country viewset and then name it on the top to league viewset. Then we also need to change the query set here, and we need to replace everything that has country and make it league. So we have the league.objects.all, but also the league serializer. And then we need to make sure that this query set is also league.objects.all, and then we are fine. And then the same thing goes for characteristics, where we have now the characteristic view set. And then we can change the query set to characteristic and also name the serializer to characteristic. And as a last step, we also need to replace the object here. And let's save that. And now inside of our urls.py file, we can simply add 2 more routes. But now one of them is going to be league, which uses the league view set with the base name also for league. And we also have characteristic, which uses the characteristic view set. And the base name is going to be characteristic. And let's now save this. And when we now return to the localhost 8000 and we refresh the page, you can see that we also have the options here for league and characteristic. And when we go to the endpoint, we see the lists of all of the leagues that we've created in the last video. And also for characteristic, we get all of the distinct characteristics that we have in our application. So this seems to be working just fine. And that is actually all for this video. In this video, I showed you how you can create an API in your Django backend by using Django Rest Framework. In the next video, we're going to continue and I'm going to show you how you can consume this data from the Django Backend API inside of the React.js frontend. And after that, we can continue and create the full CRUD process. I want to thank you very much for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.